Hello again. Today we are going to go over some of the materials I like to use in my mushroom cultivating. It's going to be a pretty basic overview. I'm just going to go over hardwood pellets, soy. Um, well, you're watching the video, so you'll see for yourself what I go over. Let's go check it out. Here are some of the materials I use in mushroom cultivation. The first thing I'm going to go over is vermiculite. It's a mineral. It's not really nutritious, or I should say it's not nutritious at all, but its purpose inside of a substrate is for water retention, just to make sure your substrate doesn't get too dehydrated. It's got reserves. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is this perlite. You can think of it as the opposite of vermiculite. What the perlite is for aeration and to keep gaps in between the substrate for aeration. And it is also just a bunch of minerals. I do believe this one is volcanic ash. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the gypsum. This is calcium. More minerals actually, but it's calcium. And you don't need much at all of it in your substrates. It's just that little bit of extra nutrition that can be the difference between a bountiful harvest and just, yeah, they fruited. So now that we got the minerals out of the way, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff I use for grain spawn. And what grain spawn is, that's the material or grain that you put in a jar or a polypropylene bag and you sterilize it and inoculate it. And after whichever container you decided to do this in, once it fully pollinates, then you transfer that grain spawn over to your bulk substrate. So the things I like to use for this is popcorn, just great value popcorn. It's super cheap, and I get a pretty good bit of pollinated mason jars, quart jars, out of one bag of popcorn. The next thing I'm going to talk about is Uncle Ben's. Who hasn't heard of the Uncle Ben tech? Well, they weren't talking about just bags of Uncle Ben rice. They were talking about the pre-cooked rice that's sealed in a bag. And I'm mentioning this just in case anyone out there has heard about the Uncle Ben tech and they were curious about it themselves. Just so you know, this isn't what they were talking about. But this is still a great grain to spawn on. 100% whole grain brown rice. It's really great. That's what I started with actually. I didn't transition over to popcorn until a few months into the hobby or business. The next thing I'm going to talk about is organic millet. Now I'm going to be honest with y'all, I have not used this as grain spawn yet. I'm going to make some jars after filming this, but I was under the false assumption that the millet was supposed to be part of a substrate like cocoa coir or hardwood pellets would be. but that is not the case. So I don't have much or anything to say about it right now, but I will let you all know in the future. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the hardwood pellets. Now, what are the pellets for? There's many mushroom species that are wood lovers. And the three main mushrooms that I'm growing, reishi, turkey tail, and lion's mane, all love hardwood. So I got a bunch of hardwood pellets. And that will be the bulk of the substrate. And what I would transfer any of these grain spawn, these three things, into after it pollinated whichever container I had it in. The next is soy pellets. This, you only want it to be 20% of your substrate, which is a pretty good bit, but it's just for added nutrition. It's not the core of the substrate in the same way that hardwood pellets are. The next ingredient is cocoa coir. I'm sure most people watching this know all about cocoa coir. It's got many uses. I use it for mushroom cultivation, but others use it for their reptile aquariums. And also, I have used it as seed starter. It's really great for that. It doesn't really have much nutrition, so it's a really good substrate for certain types of mushrooms that you don't want any kind of, well, I was going to say contamination. You don't want contamination in any of your grows. But what I mean to say is that cocoa coir is good for mushrooms that aren't naturally resilient to contamination in the way that reishi might be. But it's still something you want in your substrate for reishi, lion's mane, and turkey tail. You only want it to be about 10% of the substrate though. So this would be 50% of your substrate. This would be 20. This would be about 10. This would be about 10. You don't want both of these to be in the same substrate because they're counteractive. The gypsum, you only want to be about 1% of your substrate. So that doesn't equal up to 100. These numbers are just about 50%, about 20%. You can go higher, but I wouldn't recommend going lower. That was just a few of the materials I use in my mushroom cultivation. There is a lot of other type of equipment I use, but as far as organic material goes, that is what I use. And I guess the mycelium and the culture and the spores, that's also organic material. But I do want to clear up something I said about perlite in the last section. Most of what I said was true. The only thing that I wasn't clear on is that you don't want it to be mixed into your substrate. I should have made that clear. Your perlite, you want it to be a layer, not a casing layer, but a layer at the bottom of your monotub. to create that aeration. So you'll have the perlite at the bottom layer of the monotub is perlite, and then everything above that is organic material. I just wanted to make that clear because the way I said it, it sounded like I was saying you want to mix it in your substrate the same way you do vermiculite, only for mushrooms that don't like moisture. That mushroom doesn't exist. That living organism doesn't exist. But thank you for being here. Thank you for making it to the end. And if you would be so kind as to like and subscribe, that does so much beneficial things to the YouTube's algorithm, and I would appreciate it very much. Y'all have a nice day.